Take your seats. I know it's a very full hall. And what a great night to come out in the sleet and the rain for poetry in Pittsburgh. Thank you for coming out to hear Tracy K Smith. Good evening. I'm Stephanie Flom, Executive Director of Pittsburgh Arts and Lectures. And on behalf of Pittsburgh Arts and Lectures and our valued partner, the Carnegie Library of Pittsburgh, let's hear it for them. And tonight's co-presenter, we are so excited to partner with the University of Pittsburgh Center for African American Poetry and Poetics. Welcome. Classic Lines is here so that you can purchase books and support a great independent local bookstore. We hope that you'll be back for more Poetry Aloud events this season. In early March, we'll be presenting Ilya Kaminsky. And later that month, thanks again to the Center for African American Poetry and Poetics, Claudia Rankin appearing with photographer Carrie Mae Weems. Novelist Tiari Jones appears this Monday on our 10 evening series. There are just a few tickets available, so check that out online. The format tonight is that Tracy will read us poetry, and then Lundy Martin will join her on stage for a conversation. Dawn is a professor of English in the writing program at the University of Pittsburgh, the author of critically acclaimed books and chapbooks, and the director of the Center for African American Poetry and Poetics. Introducing Tracy K Smith tonight, on behalf of the Carnegie Library of Pittsburgh, is Mary Frances Cooper, the president and director of the Carnegie Library of Pittsburgh. Mary Frances champions the vital yet changing role of libraries. She is a visionary, a collaborator, a leader, and a true friend of the literary arts. Please welcome Mary Frances Cooper.
Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you, everyone. On behalf of the staff and board of our library, it is my honor and privilege to welcome you here this evening to our lecture hall and to our wonderful speakers. This has been a really difficult time for our community. It's been a difficult time for our country. You know that. You know people have been murdered, just going about their daily lives. They've been shot for no discernible reason other than, somebody feels like they're afraid, they feel threatened, they have hate, they have self-loathing. We've also been seeing things that, like these natural disasters, these fires in California, that are just absolutely devastating to watch those flames and those people try to get away. Or the hurricanes in the south part of our country earlier this year that just devastated so many communities. And is that because we have not really taken care of this planet that we all share in some way, shape, or form? And then I think about the people who are trying to flee their country, who are trying to be safe, who are trying to get away from violence and from oppression and from war and from famine. They just want to go somewhere where they can be safe and no one will let them in. These are the kinds of things I think that make us all feel sad, angry, frustrated, and helpless. But we're people and we have hope. We're very hopeful. We're hopeful every time we make a donation to a memorial or to a refugee aid organization. We're hopeful every time we go to a march or a protest or a vigil. We're hopeful when we vote that maybe we can vote in somebody who's going to make a difference. And we're hopeful when we support the activism of our young people. Maybe they can make the change that we can't make. But there are also little things, they're not little things, but things that you see in your life that also give you hope. Rays of sunshine. We have a poet laureate in this country. That's got to give you hope. And we don't expect that poet laureate to write ballads about patriotic scenes and militaristic odes. No, that person is an advocate for poetry, and that's what they do. And that is an amazing, hopeful thing. And when you look at all the people who have been poet laureates down through the years, you see that they really represent the diversity of thought and opinion and people in our country, and they are what we want to support, that creativity comes from all kinds of folks and from all kinds of areas. And that has got to give me hope. And you've got to be hopeful. You know, we say that words matter. We've heard that a lot lately. Words make a difference. And we have to say that words that describe our human condition, that enable us to see the world from someone else's perspective, that present things to us that we had never considered, have got to be more hopeful, more stronger than words of hate or derision or demeaning words. But the other thing that gives me hope is that our poet laureate, currently, Tracy K Smith, was appointed to that position by our current Librarian of Congress, Dr. Carla Hayden. Dr. Hayden is the first woman to have been appointed the Librarian of Congress, the first African American to be appointed the Librarian of Congress, and the first librarian in over 60 years to be appointed the Librarian of Congress. And not only is she a librarian, but she's a public librarian. And I'll tell you, public librarians believe in the value and worth of everybody we serve. It doesn't matter who you are, what you need, you come to the library, we'll help you figure it out. We believe that with access to books and reading and self-directed learning, a person can be anything he or she wants to be. Public libraries are hope. They are. They are. They're hope. So. Tracy K Smith was born in Massachusetts and raised in Northern California. She earned a BA from Harvard University and an MFA in creative writing from Columbia University. She's the author of several poetry collections, including Life on Mars, winner of the 2012 Pulitzer Prize, and a memoir, Ordinary Light, which was a finalist for the National Book Award. She is the recipient of numerous other awards and recognitions for the quality of her work and is currently a professor in the humanities and director of creating writing program in Princeton University. In 2017, when the Librarian of Congress, Carla Hayden, announced the appointment of Tracy as the 22nd Poet Laureate Consultant in Poetry, she said, "It gives me great pleasure to appoint Tracy K Smith, a poet of searching. Her work travels the world and takes on its voices, brings history and memory to life, calls on the power of literature as well as science, religion, and pop culture. With directness and deftness, she contends with the heavens or plumbs our inner depths, all to better understand what makes us most human." This past March, she was reappointed to a second term as Poet Laureate for 2018-2019. Please join me in welcoming Tracy K Smith to our stage.
Thank you. Thank you, Mary Frances, for setting such a beautiful tone. I love Pittsburgh. I have family here, and Pittsburgh has been on my heart for the last couple of weeks. I thought I would start by reading just a couple of elegies. As you know, it's a form that allows us to grieve and celebrate as well the lives of people we love. And I have two parents who are both in the afterlife. So I thought I would read a couple of poems for them, and maybe they will be useful for those of you who are grieving as well. Sorry. This is from a sequence for my mother entitled Joy. It will rain tomorrow, as it rained in the days after you died, and I will struggle with what to wear and take a place on the bus among those I will only ever know by the shape their shoulders make above the backs of the seats before mine. It's November, and storm clouds ascend above the roofs outside my window. I don't know anymore where you've gone to, whether your soul waits here, in my room, in the kitchen with the newly blown bulb, or whether it rose instantly to the kingdom of hosannas. Some nights, walking up my steps in the dark, digging for the mail and my keys, I know you are far, infinitely far from us, that you watch in the way one of us might pause a moment to watch a frenzy of ants, wanting to help, to pick up the crumb and put it down close to their hill, seeing their purpose that clearly. This is from my father. It's not that death was thinking of you or me or our family or the woman our father would abandon when he died. Death was thinking what it owed him, his ride beyond the body, its garments, beyond the taxes that swarm each year, the car and its fuel injection, the fruit trees heavy in his garden. Death led him past the aisles of tools, the freezer lined with meat, the television saying over and over, "Seek and ye shall find." So, why do we insist he has vanished, that death ran off with our everything worth having? Why not that he was swimming only through this life, his slow, graceful crawl, shoulders rippling, legs slicing away at the waves, gliding further into what life itself denies? He is only gone so far as we can tell, though when I try, I see the white cloud of his hair in the distance like an eternity. But we have a lot to do. I feel like I've been trying to learn something about compassion these last couple of years, and trying to imagine what it is that makes compassion so hard. I think in one way, love is scary. If I love you, if I truly love you, it means I have to be willing to say that your health, safety, happiness, values are as important to me as my own, and that I can't be happy or healthy or safe if you aren't those things. And I guess that's a kind of vulnerability that it's really hard to submit to. I have poems that are thinking about that, and poems that are also hoping that maybe even in the awful history that we belong to as Americans, maybe there's something we can learn from what was done wrong, something that we can see and change. So there are a lot of poems in my recent work that are looking backward and hoping that perhaps even voices from another time period might have something necessary to say that we might miraculously be able to hear. Maybe I'll start with one of those poems. This is, it's called Declaration. I had been spending a lot of time looking at documents from antebellum period and the founding moments of American democracy, and I looked at the Declaration of Independence thinking maybe I can hear something useful in this document, and I feel like it kind of sat up and said, oh, you want to hear something? Okay, take this. So this is an erasure of that text that I think speaks very undeniably to the history and nature of Black life in this country. Declaration. He has sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people. He has plundered our, ravaged our, destroyed the lives of our, taking away our, abolishing our most valuable, and altering fundamentally the forms of our. In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. We have reminded them of the circumstances of our emigration and settlement here, taken captive on the high seas to bear and while I was kind of looking through these stories, these voices, these letters, these documents, I found a number of letters and statements that were given or written by African American soldiers who served in the Civil War. The letters that they wrote to their family members or to Abraham Lincoln were pleas for help, requests for information, and intimate addresses to their family members saying, "I'm coming for you," or "Please come meet me here." And then there are these deposition statements that were given after the war, sometimes late, like into the 20th century, by descendants or widows, in an attempt to claim pensions that these veterans ought to have been entitled to. But because many of them were enslaved, they didn't have birth certificates or marriage licenses or documents attesting to name changes after emancipation. And so by these means, many of them were denied the justice of pensions. Listening to their voices kind of created a gospel in a way. It felt like there were these different pieces of a single story. And so this poem I'm going to read excerpts of is kind of a chorus of voices. It is called, "I Will Tell You the Truth About This. I Will Tell You All About It." Excellent Sir, my son went in the 54th Regiment. Sir, my husband, who is in Company K, 22nd Regiment, U.S. Colored Troops, and now in the Macon Hospital at Portsmouth with a wound in his arm, has not received any pay since last May, and then only $13. Sir, we, the members of Company D of the 55th Massachusetts Volunteers, call the attention of Your Excellency to our case. For instant, look and see that we never was freed yet, run right out of slavery, in to soldiery, and we hadn't nothing at all. And our wives and mother, most all of them, is a perishing all about. And we all are perishing ourself. I am willing to be a soldier and serve my time faithful like a man. But I think it is hard to be put off in such doggish manner as that. Will you see that the colored men fighting now are fairly treated? You ought to do this, and do it at once, not let the thing run along. Meet it quickly and manfully. We poor oppressed ones appeal to you and ask fair play. So please, if you can do any good for us, do it in the name of God. Excuse my boldness, but please, your reply will settle the matter and will be appreciated by a colored man who is willing to sacrifice his son in the cause of freedom and humanity. I have nothing more to say, hoping that you will lend a listening ear to an humble soldier. I will close. Yours, for Christ's sake. I shall have to send this without a stamp, for I hain't money enough to buy a stamp. I am 60-odd years of age. I am 62 years of age next month. I am about 65 years of age. I reckon I am about 67 years old. I am about 68 years of age. I am on the rise of 80 years of age. I am 89 years old. I am 94 years of age. I don't know my exact age. I am the claimant in this case. I've testified before you 2 different times before. I filed my claim, I think, first about 12 years ago. I am now an applicant for a pension because I understand that all soldiers are entitled to a pension. I claim pension under the general law on account of disease of eyes as a result of smallpox contracted in service. The varicose veins came on both my legs soon after the war, and the sores were there when I first put in my claim. I claim pension for rheumatism and got my toe broke, and I was struck in the side with the breech of a gun, breaking my ribs. I was a man stout and healthy, over 27 years of age when I enlisted. When I enlisted, I had a little mustache and some chin whiskers. I was a green boy right off the farm and did just what I was told to do. When I went to enlist, the recruiting officer said to me, "Your name is John Wilson." I said, "No, my name is Robert Harrison," but he put me down as John Wilson. I was known while in service by that name. I cannot read nor write, and I do not know how my name was spelled when I enlisted, nor do I know how it is spelled now. I always signed my name while in the Army by making my mark. I know my name by sound. My mother said after my discharge that the reason the officer put my name down as John Wilson was he could draw my bounty. I am the son of Solomon and Lucinda Sibley. I am the only living child of Dennis Campbell. My father was George Jordan, and my mother was Millie Jordan. My mother told me that John Barnett was my father. My mother was Mary Eliza Jackson, and my father, Reuben Jackson. My name on the roll was Frank Nunn. No, sir, it was not Frank Nern. My full name is Dick Lewis Barnett. I am the applicant for pension on account of having served under the name Lewis Smith, which was the name I wore before the days of slavery were over. My correct name is Hiram Kirkland. Some persons call me Harry, and others call me Henry, but neither is my correct name. Thinking about those lives, those stories, got me thinking about what it feels like to belong to a nation that doesn't claim you. And this is a poem that is not set in that time period, but that is wrestling with that sense. When I started writing it, I had such a sense of protection for the subject of the poem that I was having trouble getting anywhere. I didn't want anything bad to happen to the speaker of my poem. And so I had to shift positions, and I decided that I would write the poem instead from the perspective of someone who was interrogating someone else. I wrote the poem, and it sat for a little while without a title, and then I gave it this title: The United States welcomes you. Why and by whose power were you sent? What do you see that you may wish to steal? Why this dancing? Why do your dark bodies drink up all the light? What are you demanding that we feel? Have you stolen something? Then what is that leaping in your chest? What is the nature of your mission? Do you seek to offer a confession? Have you anything to do with others brought by us to harm? Then why are you afraid? And why do you invade our night, hands raised, eyes wide, mute as ghosts? Is there something you wish to confess? Is this some enigmatic type of test? What if we fail? How and to whom do we address our appeal? I love poems because they allow you to get to a better sense of your own perspective. I think language is rigorous. It forces you to move past the easy thoughts or connections and go with something that's harder, but that might enlarge you. And poems are also great because they allow you to be your real self, your flawed self, and to take stock of that too. So, lest you think I am high-minded all the time, I'm going to share some poems that are about, the struggle to see and really take stock of other people, the struggle to get past the sense of others as an obstacle to what I want. So these are two companion poems. This one is called Beatific. I watch him bob across the intersection, squat legs bowed in black sweatpants. I watch him smile at nobody, at our traffic stopped to accommodate his slow going. His arms churn the air. His comic jog carries him nowhere. But it is as if he hears a voice in our idling engines, calling him lithe, swift, prince of creation. Every least leaf shivers in the sun, while we sit, bothered, late, captive to this thing, commanding, wait for this man, wait for him. Charity. She is like a squat old machine, off kilter but still chugging along the uphill stretch of sidewalk on Harrison Street, handbag slung crosswise and, I'm guessing, heavy. And oh, the set of her face, her brows profound tracks, her mouth cinched, lips pressed flat. Watching her bend forward to tussle with gravity, watching the birth she allows each foot as if one is not on civil terms with the other. Watching her shoulders braced as if lashed by step after step after step, and her eyes' determination not to shift or blink or rise. I think, I am you, one day out of 5. Tired, empty, hating what I carry, but afraid to lay it down. Stingy, angry, doing violence to others by the sheer freight of my gloom. Halfway home, wanting to stop, to quit, but keeping going mostly out of spite. And this is a poem for my daughter, and it's a poem about, okay, it's work to submit sometimes to the will of a 4.5-year-old. But I think that's probably some of the work we are here to learn to do. So this is a poem called 4.5. morning finds her curled like a prawn around a stuffed blue Pegasus, or the smallest prawn pink lion. Or else she's barging into my room and leaning in close, so it's her hair I wake to, that coarse dark heaven of knots and purple fluff. And she's hungry, but first she has to pee. Pee, pee, she sings, hopping in place, trying to staunch off the wild, ravenous river she carries, until I'm awake for real, saying, go, go, hurry before you wet the floor. And then she tries and succeeds, or else stands bereft, relieved, as a pool trickles out around her feet. She's like an island made of rock, with one lone tree at the top of the only mountain. She's like the sole incongruous goat tethered to the tree, smiling almost as you approach, scraping the ground with its horns, and then lickety-split, lurching hard, daring the rope to snap. She's hungry. She wants bread, toasted with no skin, and enough butter to write her name in. Or a bowl of cereal, but not the noisy kind. She wants a movie, or maybe just the tussle of her will against mine, that scrape and crack, horn on rock, rope relenting one fiber at a time. I want that, she says, punctuating what she just said she wanted. I think I'll read a few more poems. This one is something that came out of a conference that was held at Princeton University, where I teach, a conference on forced migration. And I was asked to write a poem by way of closing statement based on a lot of the statements or testimonies that I had heard over the course of 2 days. And this is what I wrote. And again, I think it's kind of a thought experiment, a way of saying, how can a person learn to want to give what must be given to someone who is seeking refuge? Refuge. Until I can understand why you fled, why you are willing to bleed, why you deserve what I must be willing to cede. Let me imagine you are my mother in Montgomery, Alabama, walking to campus rather than riding the bus. I know what they call you, what they try to convince you you lack. I know your tired ankles, the sudden thunder of your laugh. Until I want to give you what I myself deserve, let me love you by loving her. Your sister in a camp in Turkey, 16, deserving of everything. Let her be my daughter, who has curled her neat hands into fists, insisting nothing is fair, and I have never loved her. Naomi, lips set in a scowl, young heart ransacking its cell. Let me lend her passion to your sister and love her for her living rage, her need for more and now and all. Let me leap from sleep if her voice sounds out afraid from down the hall. I've seen men like your father walking up Harrison Street now that the days are getting longer. Let me love them as I love my own father, whom I phoned once from a valley in my life to say what I feared I'd never adequately said, voice choked, stalled, hearing the silence spread around us like weather. What would it cost me to say it now? to a stranger's father, walking home to our separate lives together. And this is a poem that, so I spent so much time looking backward and also thinking about the stories that we tell ourselves about who we are. You know, in America, a lot of the myths that help us believe in what this nation is come from the Old Testament. And I thought that it would be a good exercise to write a new myth. So this is a poem that is an attempt to do that. It's called An Old Story. We were made to understand it would be terrible. Every small want, every niggling urge, every hate, swollen to a kind of epic wind. Livid, the land, and ravaged like a rageful dream. The worst in us having taken over and broken the rest utterly down. A long age passed, when at last we knew how little would survive us, how little we had mended or built that was not now lost. Something large and old awoke, and then our singing brought on a different manner of weather. Then animals long believed gone crept down from trees. We took new stock of one another. We wept to be reminded of such color. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to hear you tonight. It's also been such a pleasure to, over the past few weeks, sit down with all of your work and go on a kind of deep Tracy K Smith dive. So I want to start actually with a question about genre. So you were talking tonight, and you talked last night too about the power of poetry, that you love poetry. It's a way, you say, I'm summarizing here, to make sense of things or discover something new. There's a kind of magic to it. And so I was wondering if you could just say a little bit more about what makes poetry particular in this regard. If you think poetry is particular in this regard, it might be the creative process in general that helps us to know differently inside of this potential magic.
I think language is a great tool for those things, but I think poetry is extra special. I was in South Dakota recently, and someone asked me for directions on the street, and I said, I don't know. But we started talking, and I had a copy of this little anthology that I kind of carry with me. And so at the end of our conversation, I said, do you like poetry? And this man looked at me and he said, do you like prayer? And I feel like I understand what he meant. I think poetry isn't simply utilitarian language. I think it's language that's pointed at something both within and outside of ourselves. And it speaks to us and makes us receptive to something that's large and mysterious and strange. Mm-hmm. I feel like interesting work happens when we're in that state. And I think that it's wonderful to explore events and experiences in prose and to get somewhere through that thought process, and then to address the very same things in poems will take me someplace quite different, and I'm grateful for that.
I was going to ask you about that, actually, the difference, like how you know what belongs, say, in the memoir as opposed to what belongs in the poems. But it sounds like you're exploring the same concerns, the same subjects, but from inside of a different way of knowing that is, say long form essay or long form memoir?
Yeah, when I started out with the intention of writing a memoir, it was because I knew there were things that I had leapt away from in my poetry. So in the poems I've written about my mother and my father and family, I've leapt away from questions of race, questions of silence, questions of God and the struggle to become comfortable with religion. And I wanted to hold myself in place to have to go to those difficult places. And prose was the vehicle for that. It meant that I could begin doing something similar to what I do in a poem, which is to kind of move around associatively. But then I had to go back and say what happened. And then I had to go back and add these other layers that pushed me to address these questions that have been hard for me otherwise.
I do see this, I don't know if it's a kind of, I guess it's a kind of evolving way of approaching ideas around what might be called faith or belief in your work, and they also intersect, I guess, with these larger, more existential questions around being, or like the big whys of existence. So I'm curious about how you would talk about that engagement over time. Do you see yourself figuring something out, actually knowing something else, when it comes to questions of faith or belief? Do those things have they gotten more settled for you in some way?
I think so. I mean, and settled enough that I know when they unsettle themselves where to start. But when I think about who I was when I was working on my first two books, it was so new to be an adult in the world that I was grounded in the world. I wanted to think about myself in relation to intimate others and then distant strangers, and America as an entity. And as I get older, I think it's really losing a second parent and becoming a parent. My thoughts go to this other place. I think I spend part of every day trying to get my head around what the afterlife is. I have kids who bring my parents back for me. I see my dad in the way my little boy eats a piece of bread, and I want to think about what we are here doing. And poetry has been a great way to do what for me feels kind of like philosophical or soul-searching kind of work. I guess in some ways I feel momentarily settled. I feel like particularly in the work that Life on Mars helped me to do, I found a vocabulary for what I need God to be, which is larger and more systematic than the God of the Old Testament that I kind of grew up imagining, on the scale with physics and the universe and these things that we know a little bit about, and that makes me feel safe kind of moving forward.
This is the last question I have along those lines, but so when I read across your books, love is a recurring figure. To read a lot of your work in a short span of time, what happened to me is that love began to become like a figure, almost like a person. How do you, that's it, I'm going to disconnect now to a question. How do you define love? What is love? Is love bigger than the individual or smaller?
I think if you'd asked me this 8 years ago, it would be a different answer, because I would be thinking about love in private terms. But what I'm interested in now is love as a public act, love as a world-creating possibility, love as the life force that we are trying to get back to somehow in our, wrong-headed way. Why? Because it's scary to be alive right now, and because so much of what we do and what we are encouraged to do by the resources that are pointing our direction is to think only about ourselves, or first about ourselves, which is antithetical to what I think love is. And so I'm trying to learn something.
Yeah, I think about this all the time, and I think about what it means to actually practice love, not hate, or it's I think a powerful slogan, but what does it mean to actually practice that in the world, to take it up in your body, not only your work but also your body.
Yeah, I think it's a matter, a number of choices that exist on these different scales. So one of them is to say, okay, I will look at you in the street and I will make space for you and your needs or your will or your trajectory through traffic. Maybe that's a small act of love. It's a way of saying, I see you, you are real. I think if we do that enough, it becomes easier to look at people whose needs are greater than just my car stopping for a few minutes. But then I think it also exists on like an everyday scale. I was talking to my husband a little while ago, and he does this thing, which is to set items on a space that I don't believe is actually a valid space, like the little strip of countertop between the sink and me, And I said, well, finally, why do you do that? And he said, do you really need me to stop doing that? And then I said, no, I don't actually. I can decide to appreciate that you do that and leave it at that, and it's done. I think that is a very small act of love. And and I think we can go about our days practicing these acts of love until they can guide us to making the bigger, scarier steps.
So I was thinking today about Langston Hughes, and I was thinking about that space of overlap between I Too Sing America and another Hughes poem where he says, America never was America to me. And I was thinking of this because of the deep investigation of American history that happens in Wade in the Water. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your own Americanness, or your sense of your own Americanness, and I guess particularly what it's like to write about America, and as poet laureate, then be a representative in some ways of America. As a Black woman, those tensions thereof.
Yeah, that is a hard, big question. Depending on where you stand, your sense of what you belong to changes, right? Sometimes if I'm standing from a position of acknowledging the relative safety and privilege of my life, I can think about America as something that both fosters that and infringes upon that in others' lives. I think my second book is thinking a lot about that, America as a global actor. But then now I think so many of us are thinking of the fact that we are all living these different versions of what America is, what it says it is, what it feels like, what we need or want it to be, and there are contradictions in that. I feel interested in trying to imagine that it's possible to speak to a collective that is varied and full of contradictions, but that also recognizes that it is a single thing, if that makes sense. I feel one of the charges of my work as poet laureate that I see is to say, there are so many versions of America, and there are so many poets writing these versions. Let's look at 6, and let's think about how selfhood and nationhood and family and community and work and love, how they feel like such different things depending on who's speaking. And let's try and do the work of saying these are all right. Yeah.
So in the section that you read, the letters, the found poems, you choose to let the language stand, and and I would assume that they weren't written in stanzas, right? you let the language stand, and I was curious about that. Why the choice to present those voices? Because for me, when I read the book, they kind of breathe up through the pages like ghosts. And I thought of Nerbessie Phillips Zong and her work in the way that the naming of the subjects thrown overboard, board the slave ship, also were breathing up like ghosts in the work. And I was just, can you talk a little bit more about that choice to have their language be their language without alteration from you?
Yeah, I didn't have that as my intention from the outset. I thought I was going to be doing some research to write a poem I had been invited to write about the Civil War. I thought I'd read these letters and metabolize the information they contained and write a poem in my own voice. But then I saw a line in one of the first letters I read that said, it was a letter from a mother to Abraham Lincoln saying, "My son is gone. He was the only help I had. Now I am old and my head is blossoming for the grave." And I said, well, what would I do that could be better than that? And I felt, like you said, there was this living force in these voices, even in the misspellings, the strange capitalizations that people employ in this attempt to be compelling, persuasive. And so what I really quickly decided that my job was to listen and to invite other people to listen to voices that historically have been ignored. And there was a really wonderful sense of humility that brought about that made me feel like that was the right choice.
I mean, they're very haunting, and they feel like the part of the book that is like this. These people were, they are, and then there's the part of your work where you're thinking about the what ifs. There's that conceptual element, and I'm thinking about both Wade in the Water and Life on Mars. Like, there's a way that you seem to approach the work that presents a possibility for another thing given a certain set of other things, right? And this is apparent to me in a poem like The Angels. The speculation feels necessary in the poem. It feels also potentially healing. Since you didn't read that poem, I was wondering if you could read that one now and talk a little bit about how the possibility, the what if, the conceptual figured into your making that poem.
Oh, sure. This poem takes up something that was probably a dream that felt like it wasn't only a dream, and I think it indulges that. The angels. Two slung themselves across chairs once in my motel room, grizzled in leather biker gear, emissaries for something I needed to see. I was worn down by an awful panic, a wrenching in the gut, contortions. They sat there at the table while I slept. I could sense them with a deck of playing cards between them. To think of how they smelled, what comes to mind is rum and gasoline. And when they spoke, though I dared not look, I glimpsed how one's teeth were ground down almost to nubs, which makes me hope some might be straight up thugs, young, slim, raw, who bounce and roll with fearsome grace, whose very voices cause faint souls to quake. Quake then, fools, and fall away. What God do you imagine we obey? Think of the toil we must cost them, one scaled perfectly to eternity. And still they come, telling us through the ages not to fear. Just those two that once, and never again for me since. Though there are there sightings, flashes, hints, a proud tree in vivid sun, branches swaying in strong wind, rain hurling itself at the roof, boulders, mounds of earth mistaken for dead does, lions in crouch, a rust-stained pipe where a house once stood, which I take each time I pass it for an owl. Bright whorl, so dangerous and near. My mother sat whispering with it at the end of her life, while all the rooms of our house filled up with night.
I love that poem. I love the, I think one of the questions at the heart of it is, what if there were angels? And I love the way that it can hold the possibility that straight up thugs can be angels, and the figures that are closest to us.
Yeah, I guess I wanted to make this thing real, and I wanted to take up the possibility that it offered, that there are these ugly, strange, wonderful, fearsome angels here working to do what they can. And I think the work of the poem from the end of that anecdote is to try and anchor that hope, anchor that wish to something. In this poem, I think what it gets anchored to is nature. I think that nature is a site of the holy when we look at it in the right way, when we allow it to make ourselves feel small. And so the speculation that this poem is doing is, what if this is always here? What if this is always happening?
I have two more questions for you. At this point in your life, in your poetry, do you feel like you take more risks or less risks?
Oh, God. I hope I'm taking more. I feel like every writer, there's this urge to find a new way of asking the same old questions. And each new attempt ideally feels unsettling and destabilizing and enticing. So I hope that I was nervous to write about history because so many writers, particularly Black writers, have done it so indelibly. So that felt like a risk. I hear in the work a rhythm that didn't used to live in my earlier poems that tells me there's something other than the thought process that drives the poems. That feels like a departure from what was once a kind of safety that I kind of relied on in my writing. But I mean,
actually, there was one other question I wanted to ask you about those poems, which is, so I think that the reasons that we keep writing poems about enslaved Black people in this country is because it has a different kind of resonance, a different meaning, depending on what the moment is in which those poems come into being. And so this isn't necessarily a question, but I do think that there's something about them coming into being now in this work, in this moment, that's different, say, than the poems that were doing that, as you say, indelibly, 20 years ago.
Yeah, because 20 years ago it felt like history, and now it feels like something that's chasing us at increasing speed. Those questions of justice, of race, of personhood are coming undone, and so, yeah.
So, last question. In Garden of Eden, the first poem in Wade and Water, there's a way that you situate the I and time, I think, and time. The I and time. You seem to begin the book by marking an end to one kind of thing. I don't know if it's kind of existence and the beginning of another. And then the poem ends this way: the known sun setting on the dawning century. So if you were to speculate, we're still in the mode of speculation, and in this mode of speculation, you were to believe that there's a new consciousness blooming, that what's happening in this moment is a really tight, hard, painful space, but that there's a new consciousness blooming. What would you like that consciousness to be like? Or how do you imagine it?
Well, I think that last poem that I read, An Old Story, is a stab at that. It's a consciousness that understands that logic, in many cases, is no longer effective. That despite logic, we continue to do the unthinkable. And so there's something other than logic that this new age will value. I think in that poem, it's a ritual or a collective consciousness. In that poem, it's singing, which I think is a way of thinking of many things that we can embody together. And that poem arrives at what to me is very deliberately rooted in color and difference and race and identity. You know, we took new stock of one another. We wept to be reminded of such color. I think it is going to sit on the other side of doing the hard work of learning to love each other despite these ostensible differences that inflame people with fear and rage at the moment. I think there's something on the other side of that that's real.
I agree. Thank you so much. Thank you,
you.
Tracy.